Ask any pilot who flew it to describe the constellation and watch what happens to their face. Something changes, something that isn't quite a smile and isn't quite grief, but lives in the space between them, in the specific emotional territory of someone describing something they loved completely and lost permanently. One captain, 70 years in aviation behind him, and the kind of composure that a lifetime of professional flying produces, paused for a long time before he answered. Then he said, "Flying the Constellation was the only time in my life I was certain that the aircraft was as happy to be flying as I was." He knew, rationally, that aircraft don't feel things. He said it anyway, because some aircraft make you forget that. This is the story of one of them. To understand the Constellation, you have to understand the moment it was born into, and the specific extraordinary combination of ambition and necessity that produced it. The story begins as so many of aviation's most interesting stories do, with Howard Hughes. Hughes was, by the late 1930s, both a celebrated aviator in his own right and the controlling force behind TWA, Transcontinental and Western Air, one of America's major carriers and a company with ambitions that consistently exceeded its current capabilities. Hughes wanted an aircraft that could cross the continental United States non-stop, carry a meaningful number of passengers in genuine comfort, and do both of these things faster than anything currently flying. He took these requirements to Lockheed, a California company whose engineering talent was considerable and whose appetite for ambitious projects matched his own. What Lockheed produced in response was the Constellation, and from the very first glimpse of the design, it was apparent that something different was happening. Commercial aircraft of the late 1930s were functional objects. They were designed to carry people through the air efficiently, and the best of them managed to be elegant as a byproduct of good engineering. The Constellation was designed, from the beginning, to be beautiful as a primary intention, as if Lockheed's engineers had decided that the aircraft they were creating deserved the form that matched the ambition behind it. The fuselage curved, not in the incidental way that aerodynamic necessities produce curves in aircraft structures, but deliberately, expressively, a distinctive dolphin shape that gave the Constellation a profile unlike any other aircraft before or since. The triple tail, 3 vertical stabilizers instead of the conventional single fin, was a practical solution to a real engineering problem. The aircraft needed to fit in hangars designed for smaller aircraft, and a single tail of the required size wouldn't have cleared the doors. But the triple tail in practice became the Constellation's most recognizable signature, the feature that allowed you to identify the aircraft from miles away, and that gave it a visual personality that photographers and passengers and aviation enthusiasts found irresistible. The war intervened before the Constellation entered commercial service. The aircraft was pressed into military duty as the C-69 transport, carrying personnel and cargo across the Atlantic and the Pacific for the Army Air Forces. The pilots who flew it in military service were, in many cases, the first to encounter what the aircraft was capable of, and they carried what they learned back into the commercial world when the war ended. When the Constellation entered commercial service in the post-war years, it arrived into a world that was ready for it in a way that no pre-war aircraft could have been. The war had produced in America and in the countries connected to America a new appetite for speed, for distance, for the compression of geography that aviation promised. Business travel was expanding, tourism, slowly but genuinely, was beginning its long democratization. People who had never considered flying before the war found themselves in its aftermath curious about a world that had suddenly revealed itself as both larger and more accessible than they had previously imagined. The Constellation was the aircraft that met that curiosity with the most complete answer the propeller age would ever provide. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The Constellation was different from other aircraft of its era in ways that were immediately visible and in ways that only revealed themselves over time. And the combination of those two kinds of difference is what produced the particular depth of feeling that pilots and passengers developed for it. Start with what you could see. The fuselage curve was not just beautiful, it was aerodynamically purposeful, allowing the Constellation to slip through air more efficiently than a conventional straight fuselage would have permitted. The aircraft looked fast standing still, which is the rarest quality in aircraft design. Every angle, every line, every proportion suggested that what you were looking at had been shaped by something more intentional than the minimum requirements of getting people from one place to another. It suggested that the people who built it had cared about what they were building in the way that craftsmen care. personally, professionally, beyond the requirements of the specification. The four Wright Duplex-Cyclone radial engines were the heart of the Constellation's performance and the source of its most demanding characteristics. Each engine produced enormous power, the kind of power that allowed the Constellation to cruise at altitudes and speeds that set new standards for commercial transport. But these engines were also complex in a way that demanded constant, attentive management from the pilots and flight engineers responsible for them. The fuel system required careful monitoring. The superchargers that allowed the engines to maintain power at high altitude were sophisticated mechanisms that could fail in specific, consequential ways if not managed correctly. The cowl flaps that controlled engine cooling required active adjustment throughout the flight as power settings and outside air temperatures changed. All of this meant that flying the Constellation was, for the crew, a genuinely active experience throughout every phase of every flight. There was no cruising on autopilot in the sense of simply monitoring. There was continuous management, continuous attention, continuous engagement with a machine that rewarded expertise and responded poorly to complacency. Pilots who flew the Constellation described this not as a burden, but as a form of respect, the aircraft demanding the you be as serious about flying it as it was about being flown. The pressurization system was another area where the Constellation set new standards. Earlier commercial aircraft had offered rudimentary pressurization, adequate but imperfect, leaving passengers with the sinus discomfort and mild headaches that high-altitude flight without full pressurization produced. The Constellation's pressurization allowed it to cruise at altitudes where the ride was smoother and the air was thinner, while maintaining a cabin environment that passengers experience that's comfortable. This was not invisible to passengers. It was one of the things they talked about after flying on the Constellation for the first time. The absence of the physical discomfort they had expected from previous long flights was itself remarkable, and it contributed significantly to the aircraft's reputation among the traveling public. The cabin itself was a different experience from what commercial aviation had previously offered, wider than most of its contemporaries, quieter in ways that the Constellation's pressurization and insulation made possible, arranged with a genuine attention to passenger comfort that reflected both the aircraft's capabilities and the ambitions of the airlines that operated it. TWA, Pan American, and KLM, among the most important operators, understood that the aircraft allowed them to offer a quality of long-haul travel that was genuinely new, and they invested in the interior fittings and service standards to match what the aircraft made possible. But it was in the cockpit and in the specific quality of engagement that the cockpit demanded that the Constellation was most completely itself. The instrument panel was dense with gauges, 4 engines, each with its own set of monitoring instruments, surrounded by the navigation, communication, and flight instruments required for long transoceanic flights. Managing all of it required a 3-person crew: captain, first officer, and flight engineer, working in continuous coordination across flights that could last 12 or 14 hours. The flight engineer station, facing sideways at a panel of systems controls, was a specialist position that demanded a level of technical knowledge and situational awareness that produced in the people who occupied it a particular expertise that they describe as the deepest professional knowledge of their careers. The Constellation handled, at altitude in smooth air, in a grace that pilots consistently describe as the best part of flying it. The controls were responsive without being twitchy, physically demanding without being exhausting. The aircraft communicated its state through the controls in the way that good aircraft always communicate, continuously, honestly, with enough subtlety that the pilot who was paying full attention received more information than the one who wasn't. Flying a Constellation across the North Atlantic at night, in smooth air with the stars visible through the cockpit windows and the 4 radials singing their particular chord, pilots who experience this describe it in terms that they acknowledge sound sentimental and offer it anyway, because the experience was genuinely what they say it was. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The human experience of the Constellation is told in a register that is consistently more personal and more emotionally direct than the testimony most aircraft generate, because the Constellation produced, in the people who worked with it and traveled on it, a quality of feeling that they never subsequently found elsewhere, and never fully recovered from losing. Pilots who flew the Constellation as their primary aircraft, who spent years in its left seat crossing oceans and continents in all conditions, describe the transition to other aircraft afterward with a consistency that is striking. Better aircraft came, faster, more reliable, more economical, with systems that didn't demand the constant vigilance that the Constellation's Wright radials required. The pilots who moved to those aircraft were professionally competent in them within the expected time frame. What they were not, and what many of them say they never again became, was in love. The Constellation had taken something, some quality of engagement, some depth of relationship between pilot and aircraft that its successors, for all their genuine improvements, could not replicate. One TWA captain who flew Constellations for 8 years before transitioning to jets describes the experience this way. Every other aircraft I flew, I operated. The Constellation, I flew. The distinction sounds small. It was everything. The flight engineers who managed the Constellation systems occupied a position that was, in the era of the aircraft's operation, among the most technically demanding in commercial aviation. 4 complex radial engines, each requiring individual monitoring and management. Fuel systems requiring continuous attention as consumption changed with altitude and power settings. Pressurization systems sophisticated enough to maintain passenger comfort at altitudes that earlier aircraft couldn't sustain. The flight engineer who truly knew the Constellation, who had accumulated the specific, deep operational knowledge that the aircraft's complexity rewarded, was a professional whose expertise was visible and respected in the way that genuine mastery is always visible and respected. Several veterans of the position described the Constellation as the aircraft that completed their professional education, not because it was the hardest aircraft they worked on, but because its demands were comprehensive enough that meeting them required the full development of everything a flight engineer could become. The passengers who flew on Constellations in the late 1940s and through the 1950s were, many of them, experiencing something they had no framework to compare against: long-haul commercial flying at a standard that no previous aircraft had made possible. The comfort was genuinely new. The speed was genuinely new. The altitude at which they traveled and the smoothness of the ride at that altitude were genuinely new. Passengers who crossed the Atlantic on the Constellation for the first time describe an experience that felt less like the commercial aviation they had known and more like something that had been created specifically to demonstrate what aviation could be at its best. Some of them dressed for it. Some of them took photographs from the windows with the specific awareness that they were participating in something worth documenting. Some of them remember individual flights decades later with a clarity that routine travel never produces. The mechanics who maintain the Constellation's Wright Duplex-Cyclone engines have their own chapter, and it is a chapter that contains more honest admission of difficulty than the pilot and passenger accounts. The radials were powerful and capable, and, when properly maintained, reliable enough for transoceanic operations they supported. They were also maintenance-intensive in a way that required genuine expertise and constant attention. Keeping 4 Constellation engines in the condition required for commercial certification was demanding work, demanding in hours, demanding in skill, and occasionally demanding in the specific way of finding and addressing problems in systems complex enough that problems could hide. Mechanics who mastered the Constellation's power plants described that mastery with pride and with the particular weariness of people who earned something at real cost. The aircraft asked a great deal of the people who kept it flying, and it asked it consistently, without respite, across the entire operational life of every airframe. The Constellation's conflict was the most elegant and the most brutal in commercial aviation history because it was defeated not by a rival propeller aircraft that outperformed it, not by a safety record that undermined confidence in it, not by an economic failure that made it unsustainable. It was defeated by the jet engine, by a technology so comprehensively superior in speed and economics that no propeller aircraft, however magnificent, could compete with it on any route where both were available. The Boeing 707 entered service in 1958. The Douglas DC-8 followed in 1959. Within a few years, the major airlines that had built their long-haul operations around the Constellation were transitioning to jets as quickly as deliveries allowed. The economics were not subtle. The jets were faster, carried more passengers, burned less fuel per seat mile at the speeds and altitudes they operated, and required less maintenance per flight hour than the complex radial engines of the Constellation. The case for the Constellation against the jets was not a commercial case. It was an aesthetic one, and commercial aviation does not make fleet decisions on aesthetics. The pilots who had loved the Constellation most completely were, in many cases, the ones who found the transition to jets most disorienting, not technically, because they were professional enough to master the new aircraft, but emotionally, because the new aircraft didn't ask of them what the Constellation had asked. The engagement was different. The relationship was different. The specific quality of being needed by an aircraft, of having your skill and your attention matter in a continuous, physical way throughout every flight, was different on the jets, in a way that some pilots never fully made peace with. The Constellation moved to smaller carriers as the majors transitioned to jets. It served in freight operations. It appeared on routes where jet service hadn't yet arrived. And gradually, with the particular slowness of an aircraft whose operators loved it enough to keep finding reasons to keep it flying, it disappeared from service. Not in a single moment, but in a long, reluctant farewell that lasted through the 1960s and into the early 1970s. The last Constellation passengers arrived at their destinations and didn't know they were the last. Nobody made an announcement. Nobody organized a ceremony. The era simply ended, the way eras always end. Not at a moment that announces itself, but at a moment that you only recognize as the last one when you look back from the distance of years. The Lockheed Constellation's legacy is visible every time a restored example runs its engines at an airshow and the crowd goes quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for something to happen, the specific quiet of people in the presence of something that affects them in a way they didn't entirely anticipate. Something that is more beautiful in person than any photograph prepared them for, and louder and more live feeling, and more connected to a quality of aviation that the modern world no longer produces. The Constellation is the only propeller transport from the post-war era that consistently generates this response. Other aircraft from the same period are respected, admired, appreciated by enthusiasts who understand their historical significance. The Constellation is loved by people who flew on it, by pilots who flew it, and by people who never encountered it at all, but who respond to its presence with the particular emotion that genuinely beautiful things produce in people who weren't expecting to be moved. What the Constellation's legacy preserves is the memory of a specific kind of flying and a specific kind of relationship between humans and aircraft that the jet age replaced with something more efficient and less intimate. It preserves the memory of an era when the aircraft you flew demanded everything you had and gave back something that the people who experienced it have never found adequate words for. Several preserved Constellations are still flying today, maintained by organizations whose members have devoted extraordinary resources of time and money and expertise to keeping engines running and airframes airworthy that the world stopped building new parts for decades ago. The people who do this work are not doing it for any commercial reason. They're doing it because they understand, in the specific way that people understand things they love, that what they're preserving is worth more than the cost of preserving it. We began with a question. How did a single aircraft manage to make pilots fall in love with flying and then break their hearts? The answer is that it did both things the same way, completely. The Constellation didn't offer a partial relationship. It didn't allow the professional distance that most aircraft maintain between themselves and the people who fly them. It demanded full engagement, physical, intellectual, emotional. And in demanding it, it produced in the people who gave it something that they subsequently found themselves unable to find elsewhere. And then the jet age arrived, and the Constellation became obsolete, and the pilots who had given it everything found themselves in aircraft that were better in every measurable respect, and that asked of them something fundamentally different. Not less skilled, not less demanding in technical terms, but different. And the difference was in the direction of less intimacy, less physical engagement, less of the particular quality of being needed by a machine in a way that made you feel your presence in the cockpit was essential rather than supervisory. That loss is what the pilots are describing when their faces do the thing they do when you ask them about the Constellation. They are not being sentimental about an old aircraft. They are being honest about an experience that the world has not found a way to replace. The Constellation made them fall in love with flying in the most complete way that a machine can make a person fall in love with anything. And then the world moved on, and they were left with the memory of what complete felt like, which, as anyone who has loved something completely and lost it will tell you, is both the best thing and the hardest thing to carry. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.